What's up, Psychedelic Spotlight? It's your boy James coming at you with a brand new episode of the Psych Business Roundup. Today, we're going to be discussing Compass Pathways Phase 2b clinical trial results, testing treating treatment-resistant depression using psilocybin. Now, as all of you guys already know, this trial was so exciting for a couple of reasons. First, it was the furthest progressed clinical trial using psilocybin ever, being in Phase 2b, and second, it was the largest ever clinical trial using psychedelic substances, with 219 people completing the trial. And this is why I am so sad to report to you guys that the results were very disappointing. Positive, but disappointing. Now, we're going to get to why in just a second, but first let's give a brief rundown of how this trial was structured. So first, like I said, there was 219 patients that completed it, and all of these patients had treatment-resistant depression. What this means is that everybody has attempted to treat their depression at least twice in the past unsuccessfully. Now, these people were then split into 3 cohorts. We had the 1 milligram group of COMP360, Compass's proprietary formulation of psilocybin. We had the 10 milligram group, and we had the 25 milligram group. And for the purposes of this episode, we care most about the 25 milligram group. One of the last really important things to mention is that previous to the commencement of the study, all participants had to stop taking any depression medication they were on, like SSRIs. Once the study had commenced, both before the dosing, after the dosing, and then 12 weeks after the dosing, all patients filled out something called the Montgomery Asperger Depression Rating Scale, or the MADRS scale. This is basically a questionnaire that can rank how depressed a person is, and it goes from 0, which would be perfect mental health, to 60, which would be the worst of the worst. So now that we have a basic understanding of how this trial was conducted, let's take a look at some of the results. And again, I did find them to be quite disappointing personally. Not because the data itself was negative, in fact it was positive, we'll get to that in a moment, but rather because it didn't meet our extremely high expectations. So a lot of you are probably aware of the MAPS Phase 3 clinical trial that used MDMA to treat PTSD. There, they found absolutely stunning results. They found 67% of people improved so much that they no longer qualified to be having PTSD, also known as a cure. And then they found a full 88% of people had their symptoms decreased by more than 50%. These results were revolutionary, and I was kind of hoping to see similar things in this Compass Pathways test, and unfortunately we just didn't see that. So I set the bar too high, unfortunately, and now when we get positive results that don't quite live up to that hype, I feel a little bit disappointed. So let's hop into what those results are. The top line number was that 32.9% of people in the 25 milligram group saw their depressive symptoms decrease by 50% or more after 12 weeks. Now, this is compared to only 17.7% of people in the placebo group, which means that almost twice as many people saw their depression symptoms decrease by 50% if they had taken the large dose of psilocybin as compared to the placebo. Therefore, we can see just by looking at the numbers that there is obviously some statistical significance here working. So, again, what we have here is a positive number. A third of people saw their symptoms decrease by 50% or more, but not necessarily the 80+% that we had been hoping for. The next main statistic revolves around remission rates. So we saw that 26.6% of people that were in the 25 milligram group saw themselves in remission after 12 weeks. This compared to the 10.1% of people that were in the 1 milligram group. So again, we do have fairly positive results. Between 2 to 3 times as many people that were in the 25 milligram group entered remission as in the placebo group. But again, we weren't really going for a quarter of people entering remission. We wanted to hit that 50%. So these are both positive and disappointing at the same time, especially when you consider the high expectations that we had going into it. The final important statistic to talk about is the number of serious adverse events that happened. So of the 219 people who completed the trial, we saw 12 patients, 5 of which were in the 25 milligram group, have serious adverse events such as suicidal behavior or self-harm. Now, when thinking about this, it's important to remember that the people that were in this study did have serious depression, treatment-resistant depression. So it's hard to tell how much of this is correlation as compared to causation. One could imagine that some of these people, even if they didn't undergo a psilocybin clinical trial, because they had severe depression, might have still had these suicidal thoughts, might have still had self-harm. So it's really difficult to tell how much, if any, of this came from the psilocybin treatment itself. Nevertheless, it's important to talk about and to mention that we did have these 12 patients that had serious adverse events. Alright, so now that we have the base top-line data, and we understand that it's not as positive as we want it to be, although it is still positive, how do we think about this? How do we put it into context? Well, luckily, we have spent about a week in Miami at Wonderland, the world's largest psychedelic medicines conference. We just got back from it. That's why this video is actually a little bit late, guys. And we got to talk to lots of scientists and people in the industry about the results of this clinical trial. And they were saying some similar things. First and foremost, we have to understand that the population within this clinical trial all had treatment-resistant depression, the worst of the worst. They have all tried in the past multiple times to cure themselves of their depression, and it has not worked. Therefore, we would expect that the results of people with treatment-resistant depression would be lower than those with major depressive disorder. So you guys might remember a couple weeks ago, some data was released from a study using COMP360, Compass's psilocybin, to treat major depressive disorder. And the results there were absolutely fantastic. We had 50% of people in remission, and 80% of people had their symptoms decreased by 50% or more. Now, this was a small study, only 30 people. It was also open label, no control group, so we can't extrapolate too much data from it. But we can just very roughly and non-scientifically look at the results of these two studies side by side and see that those with treatment-resistant depression seem to be affected less well than those with just major depressive disorder. Again, we need larger studies, but it makes sense that for the more serious form of depression, the results would be less positive. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing, and we actually heard this quite a lot at the conference, was because people in this trial had to stop taking their SSRIs before it began, there might have been some hidden negative side effects of people who have been taking SSRIs for years or decades even, have to stop it cold turkey. And that might have negatively affected the results somewhat. Perhaps it would have been better to have them continue on with their SSRIs while undergoing psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. In fact, MindMed recently put out a small study that looked at the effectiveness of psilocybin when people were on SSRIs compared to when they weren't on SSRIs, and they actually found in this small study that needs to be repeated with larger population groups, they actually found that psilocybin was more effective when people were on SSRIs as compared to when they weren't on SSRIs. So maybe we could see this Compass Pathways study repeated, but with the people remaining on SSRIs, and perhaps the results would be better. Again, just speculation. I have no idea if that would be the case or not, but it's something to keep in mind. Third, perhaps psilocybin just isn't the best drug. Perhaps MDMA for psychotherapy is the better drug, and when we eventually see MDMA-assisted psychotherapy to treat depression, we'll get equally as great results as we saw with PTSD, and we'll just have learned that psilocybin, while great for certain things, isn't the best psychotherapy drug, and that's MDMA. Or maybe it's DMT, or maybe it's LSD, or maybe it's a modified version of psilocybin. We just need to keep in mind that because one trial didn't have the most fantastic results in the world, doesn't mean that other substances won't do better. And finally, perhaps the protocols of this study could be jigged with a little bit. So we were actually talking to a famous psychedelic psychotherapist while we were in Miami, and he does ketamine-assisted psychotherapy as well as ibogaine treatments, and he was telling us that his protocol was between 6 to 8 ketamine sessions within a few months, as opposed to just one dosing session, which is what we had in this Compass Pathways trial. So it's possible that if these patients had 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 dosing sessions instead of just one, we could have seen very different results. Again, just speculation. I have no idea. The idea that I am just trying to drill home to you guys is that this was really, in some senses, the first of its kind study. We need to see many different studies that tweak things here and there, tweak the protocol, have more dosing sessions, have different dosing amounts, have people on their SSRIs, people not on their SSRIs, etc. So where do we go from here, having put this in a little bit of context? Well, first and foremost, Compass Pathways is still going to have their phase 3 clinical trial. Again, this wasn't the most exciting results in the world, but it was still very positive and definitely positive enough for a phase 3 clinical trial, so you still should be excited for that. Second, Compass should be doing lots of other similar clinical trials, testing, treating depression, sometimes major depressive disorder, maybe sometimes with multiple doses, maybe sometimes with people on SSRIs, just get as much data as possible. And then, of course, we want to see other companies using different substances as well, so we can just compare and contrast to see what is the best. So again, guys, this is positive data. This isn't get up and do a dance routine positive data. I was hoping it was get up and do a dance routine positive data, but it wasn't, unfortunately. But this isn't a disaster either. We shouldn't be panicking, and if you're an investor in the space, you shouldn't be dumping all of your shares in all your psychedelic medicines companies. This was very mixed data, and we just have to wait to see more data is basically where we're at. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you like, subscribe. Of course, go to psychedelicspotlight.com. Check out their newsletter. Make sure you subscribe there too. And we will see you soon. I love you guys. Thank you for your continued support. And we'll see you the next time we got some big news for you.